first of all, I'd just say that the idea of this talk, I thought, rather than being a very academic talk, I'd like it to be kind of more visual, more personal, and kind of reflective. And so it's just going to show you, I'm going to show you some images and just give you some of my thoughts about, I suppose, archaeology in general, what archaeology is, and then also a little bit about how archaeology operates within Palestine and how it has operated. I'm sure those of you who know, and most of you will know a lot about the general history of Palestine, particularly during the 20th century. Most of you will be aware that there's a huge amount written on Palestinian history, Palestinian politics of the 20th century and the conflict between Israel and Palestine. And I'm sure you'll also be aware from various things, not just the news, but many different forms, that also archaeology features quite a lot within this kind of within this conflict, and also within this within the whole region of Palestine as a method of both communicating and also kind of stopping communication, and also as a means of propaganda. So I thought, as I said, I'd like this talk to really relate a little bit to the exhibition and the spirit of the exhibition. And it's divided into about 6 different sections. In the first section, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, which I think is very important for the archaeology of Palestine, and sort of kind of a good and optimistic starting point. And then I'm going to say a little bit about what I think archaeology kind of is or should be, or how it's sort of practiced in general, in a sort of kind of theoretical but also in a worldwide perspective. And then moving a little bit closer, I'd like to say a few things about, I suppose, biblical archaeology and its relationship with Israeli archaeology. I think that's quite an important thing, which I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of. And then I'd like to say a little bit about the idea of archaeology as conflict. Archaeology can be many things. There's a lot been written about the different things that archaeology can be, but I think the idea of archaeology as conflict is very interesting within this context. And then the fifth thing I was going to talk about, which is quite difficult, but I'm sure it can sort of be developed, and this is what Larissa Sansor has done in this exhibition, which I think is very promising, is the idea of archaeology as time travel, the idea that you can actually operate in this 4th dimension and you can move into different periods. And some of those periods may have been real, maybe be real in the future, but they can also be entirely fictional. And lastly, I'm going to say a little bit about authenticity. And I think authenticity is something which in archaeology seems to me to be something that's coming more and more to the foreground, as something that's kind of important and something that's sort of essential to the concept of archaeology. It's got an important input into archaeology. So, okay. So I should probably also say about the title, The Unrepeatable Experiment. The idea of this came to me, and this is something from actually from the invasion of Iraq actually in 2003, and it's the idea that that you can compare like warfare. Warfare totally destroys things, and so does archaeology. And it's particularly when I talk about archaeology, I'm talking about excavation. You actually destroy the evidence as you're doing it, and so that's kind of where the idea for this talk came from. So to start off on kind of an optimistic note, well, just this is a newspaper cutting from the Palestine Gazette from 1917. So technically, this was still, I think, is still enemy-occupied territory officially at that point, and just after the the Ottomans had been defeated within Palestine, and this is the idea for establishing a new museum in Palestine. So one of the first priorities of the British High Commissioner in Palestine was to actually found this new museum. And as you can see, the idea is specifically to also house the Department of Antiquities and to have a library and also archives. In other words, all the things you need to do to, particularly at that time, this is very advanced, what you kind of need to operate, carrying out archaeological work, recording the results, and also showing them to the public. So it's all going to be concentrated in this one building. And as you can see, it was the idea was it was funded by J.D. Rockefeller, and with £40,000, it actually ended up costing quite a lot more than that. The idea for the museum in the first place came from the famous Egyptologist Henry Breasted, who also founded the Oriental Institute in Chicago. So he was a very generous philanthropist with a particular interest in I suppose the Middle East and in this case towards Palestine. Now the building was located in a vineyard, Carmel Sheikh, and is directly opposite the northwest corner of the old city. So it's in a very important position, just outside the walls of Jerusalem, looking at the walls of Jerusalem, but not actually impinging on the old city itself. And the cost of the building, as I say, initially £40,000. It actually took a lot longer to build than was anticipated, like many museum projects, and is actually only finally opened in 1938. It's just a picture of the building. Now, the architect of the building was Austin Harrison. He was a British architect he spent a lot of time in Greece, and he'd actually done a lot of work in Macedonia. And as well as an active architect designing buildings, he's also very much interested in the history of architecture, and in particular Islamic architecture. And so he is very keen when he's designing this to actually incorporate all elements of, I suppose, the history and architectural history of Palestine within the building. And I've actually seen articles, it's handwritten versions of his articles on architecture in 18th century Palestine, which are still sort of very good and haven't really been superseded. So he was both an architect and a scholar of the architecture of the region. Now, the interior of the building, the idea he had of designing this building was to merge kind of European ideas of architecture with what might be called Eastern or Middle Eastern, what he called them Oriental. And so the building is built around this very pleasant courtyard with fountains in the centre and a series of arcades. Also included in there, you can see just in the background at the end of the pool, there's a little iwan which is decorated with these tiles which were made by the Armenian potter David Ohanessian from Kütahya, who's moved from Kütahya and came from Kütahya, which is in eastern Turkey in 1918, specifically to help with the restoration of the Dome of the Rock at the time. And then he also did lots of other commissions within Jerusalem. And but apparently this is his most complex design for the Rockefeller Museum. Now the other person involved, another person involved in the design, in the actual decoration of the museum, was the controversial but nevertheless very famous architect Eric Gill, who's most famous for his work on Broadcasting House in London. Well, he did lots of things, but that's the building I happen to know best. But he also he actually carved these sculptures in the courtyard of the museum as it's being built. When he did the carvings, he's dressed up in Arab clothes, and he most of the time, fortunately. And his idea was he wanted to make sculptures of all the different cultures that were represented in the museum. So I'm not quite sure what this is, but maybe it's European or Crusader, and this may be Mesopotamian or Assyrian, I'm not sure. But he just wanted to include the major cultures of the region. And now going back to Harrison's design. This is the design with you can see the courtyard in the center with the two wings. The different wings was apparently modeled on European architecture, as was also the design of the halls on the interior. So according to Harrison, he wanted these halls to be cathedral-like. So he evidently thought of the idea of a museum as being something that's kind of quasi-religious and something that would elevate people. And you can see that the windows are placed very high up, so you're not looking out, but you also have natural light, and it's to give kind of an elevated feeling to the whole thing. And then the Middle Eastern elements, obviously, you've seen the ceramic tiles and the courtyard, and also he used lots of open work designs and vaulted and domed ceilings within the buildings, which he considered to be a Middle Eastern idea. And then we come to the actual organisation of the galleries themselves. This was carried out or designed by another British archaeologist. This is John Illith, who specifically wanted to have a balanced story of the history of Palestine from prehistoric times to the Middle Ages. So he wanted to be inclusive. And the whole idea of the layout of the museum was that you followed from one period to the other, and it is entirely representative of the whole history of Palestine. Fortunately, partly because of the various conflicts and disputes over ownership, the actual museum layout, the exhibition layout on the interior, has stayed more or less the same as it was in the time of the mandate. So here, for example, you've got this sort of, I suppose, 1940s layout of exhibition style. And it was very strongly focused on, not in this picture, but in other ones, on typologies, developing typologies, and also showing, I suppose, general developments and influences on the archaeology of Palestine. So as I say, it was opened in 1938 as the Palestine Archaeological Museum. And then because it's obviously located in East Jerusalem, once the State of Israel was declared, this part of Jerusalem was in East Jerusalem and is under Jordanian control. And so it carried on as the Palestine Archaeological Museum after the war. But in 1966, it was nationalized by the Jordanian government, and it became a national museum. And then that occurred just before the Israeli invasion, and now it's under Israeli control. So, okay, so that's just the sort of kind of background of I suppose what the archaeology of Palestine could be like. How it could have developed. It's kind of a picture of where it was going. And just to give you kind of a perspective, something that I'm kind of aware of, I know that, for example, the National Museum in Wales was founded in the idea of developing the museum started in 1901, and again it wasn't really realised until about the same time in the 1930s. So this is very typical of kind of the national development of museums around the world, and it gives you kind of an idea of where Palestine could have gone in its archaeology. Okay, so that's just a look at where archaeology could have gone. Now I'm going to say a little bit about what I think archaeology is, and kind of for those who are sort of less familiar with archaeology. So I suppose I could start by saying what archaeology is not, because all around the world, there's people who know about archaeology and have a great interest in it, but there's lots of people who have perhaps less interest or spent less time looking at it, who have less idea. And then there's people who have completely no idea. And it's worth saying exactly what it's not. So I suppose, and these things are, what it's not, these things will become relevant in the rest of the talk. So the first thing that I'd say it very much is not is treasure hunting. So archaeology is not about finding golden objects which are just valuable in themselves for their gold weight and then selling them or keeping them yourself. It's not about that. The second thing, which I think is quite important to say, is it's not really an illustration of history. It's fully a part of history. It's part of a narrative. It's not used to illustrate stories. It actually adds to the stories, or sometimes is the story itself. So it's something different from illustration. And again, you'll see this might be relevant later on. The third thing it's not is it's not about beautiful objects. Most archaeological excavations do not find particularly beautiful objects. Even if you do find beautiful objects, they're often broken and they're not incomplete. You may find them, but that's what it's not about. And obviously archaeologists will value beautiful objects, but it's not about that. It's not about the... another misconception, it's also not about sort of discovering ancient civilizations, discovering lost worlds. And that's kind of because of ideas to do with Orientalism, things like that. It's not about discovering primitive civilizations or anything like that. So those are some ideas of things that it's not. So what is archaeology? I suppose... in my view, I think archaeology is very much a scientific discipline. The actual tools of archaeology, the basic tools, which are usually used in things like when you actually excavate an area, can be quite simple and they can be quite crude. And you could say, well, these aren't particularly exact sciences. But the main thing about archaeology is that for archaeology to be meaningful, it has to be scientific. Now, what does that mean? I suppose... on a practical level, scientific means it's not about opinion, it's about measurement, it's about things which are agreed on beforehand, it's about quantifiable results, it's about things that can be demonstrated, it's about evidence. And in another analogy, I suppose, and at the moment I'm finding this the most useful thing, for me archaeology is really... there is one sub-branch or one branch of archaeology now called forensic archaeology. I'd like to say, particularly in the context of Palestine, I'd say that all archaeology is in a sense forensic. It's about trying to determine what happened in the past. It's just looking for the evidence. That's what you're interested in. You're not interested in the objects themselves. You may be, but you're interested in what they can tell you about what happened before, how they can reconstruct things. And so I suppose, yeah, it's in philosophical terms, it's a hypothetical deductive method. Now archaeology has obviously changed because archaeology has in some form has existed for probably thousands of years, and it's no point really trying to pin down exactly when. But I suppose it's developed along with human knowledge about a variety of sciences. So obviously the archaeology that was practiced in the 18th century in England or Italy was very different from archaeology now, but that's just part of the way science has developed. And so I suppose... but I think archaeology really became more explicitly related to science, maybe in the 1970s with the development of things like new archaeology, where they developed the idea that you could have models of what might have happened in the past, and then you test them. So you actually have a specifically scientific method of setting up a theory and then testing it. So that's one of the things that becomes more important. And then things like environmental archaeology become more important, and that's things like looking at bones, looking at seeds, but also it's more than that. It's not just looking about humans, it's about looking about the environment that humans live in. It's looking about something a bit wider than actual societies, but about human relationship with the planet. And then I suppose sort of in the 70s and 80s, I suppose archaeology developed more of an identity as a very different and separate discipline from history, because before that it had been seen perhaps as one branch of history, one method of getting at historical information. And then there's the idea that actually it has a very different approach to looking at the past, and so and a lot of this is sort of academic politics, but it's also quite important because it laid out some of the ways that in which archaeology can investigate the past. And then more recently, in the 1990s, there's the idea that you have to question archaeology. It's claimed to be have some form of neutrality, because I think that was one of the ideas that archaeology claimed, was it was kind of an independent, neutral way of investigating the past. And then from the 1990s, this was questioned and saying, well, because archaeologists have kind of control of the evidence, they can also control the story, and that it's actually impossible to give a sort of really neutral story of the past. So that's just kind of a very quick sort of look at sort of archaeological history, or how it developed during the 20th century. And that's sort of without any reference to Palestine. Okay. This is out of sequence, never mind. Okay. Yeah, so this is just, oh, you can't see it. Not even out of sequence. So this is just a picture from a very long time ago of an archaeological excavation taking place in the 1980s. And this is just to give you an idea of what an excavation takes, how excavations kind of work. So you have a number of people on a site, and they have various tools for digging, and they buckets, and they gradually remove the soil, and they gradually uncover and find out the history of the site. So this is that same location several weeks later. So this happens to be a Crusader tower, and the idea is that you're actually systematically excavating according to the different contexts. So this is different types of soil which you find, and you're trying to, as I say, it's like forensics. You're trying to uncover what happened. You want to know the story. You might be interested in the architecture, but you really want to know the story of how people were living in here, what they're doing. And so this is kind of an idea of how an excavation might proceed. Now we come to Palestine and the idea of archaeology in Palestine. I'm sure you'll all be aware, and it's no surprise really, that archaeology in Palestine is one of the first places that really attracted archaeologists. Along with ancient Greece, it had a really big pull for people. And this goes way back to pilgrims from British perspective, from Anglo-Saxon times, probably even earlier. Constantine's mother is apparently meant to have done some archaeology. So archaeology so the Holy Land, Palestine, has always attracted people interested in, I suppose, the roots in particular of Christianity, Judaism and Islam. So there's always been an idea of carrying out archaeology there. But of course it's problematic, because you're linking it with things which are religions, and the religions are also cultures. And so immediately you kind of have, I suppose you already have a story, and this is part of the problem. You already have ideas of what you're interested in and what kind of will appear. So what have we got here? This is the sort of example of some of the archaeology. So this is in the Kidron Valley. This is just to the on the east side of the old city, and this is two tombs from, I suppose, the sort of Roman late Hellenistic period. One is the one on the left is Jehoshaphat's cave, so called, and on the right you've got Absalom's tomb. Now there is actually no evidence connecting either of these places with the figures mentioned. Now, I'm not quite sure how either of these tombs acquired these names. It may have been quite a long time ago, probably from pilgrims. But the thing is, immediately you've got this problem in Palestine, is that you've got pilgrims and various travellers have been going there for at least 1.5 millennia, probably longer, more than that, probably 2 millennia, giving names to things. And so the idea of doing scientific archaeology, you're already challenged with very strongly entrenched popular notions of kind of what should be there. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the idea of what archaeology, how archaeology developed elsewhere. Within the Middle East, there's an idea of, I suppose, biblical archaeology. And this is kind of one of the things I said that I don't think archaeology should be, but often is, certainly in this region, is the idea that it kind of illustrates something, in this case the Bible. So the idea is of a tradition of biblical archaeology which goes back a long way, and it's really finding sites which relate to events that happened in the Bible, and literally kind of trying to read back and look for actual physical, tangible evidence of that past. It doesn't. You already know the story, but you kind of want to find out. You want to find some actual proof, but you kind of already know the answer, which is part of the problem. And so one of the things about the tradition of biblical archaeology, it has an obsession with key named sites. So it's really very interested in these key named sites. The site which you can see here, this is Tel Sultan in Jericho. This is a tell at Jericho, and a long time ago. And the idea is that you can literally actually read the story of the site from the pottery, from the remains that you can see in the site. But even just in this picture, I think one of the interesting things is that you see this interest in obviously this very important Neolithic Tel site, one of the very earliest settlements, and undeniably very, very important in all periods, located next to the well. But what you can also see in the background is you can see all these mud brick houses. And here's just another view of these mud brick houses. These mud brick houses no longer exist. These are all part of El-Nimer refugee camp, which was established in 1948 to take refugees who were fleeing from the Israeli occupation, and they're settled near the Tel. And actually, many of the people who lived in this refugee camp actually worked on the excavations in Jericho. So there's a sort of direct link. But these houses, you think, well, why are they interesting? Are they archaeology? Well, the interesting thing is, of course, they've been demolished now. There is no evidence of them. They've been bulldozed away. This started, I think, in the late 1980s. And so all evidence of this is gone. So these existed between about 1948 and about 1968 when the camp was bombed and the people living in there had to flee to Jordan. So the question is, and interestingly, the documentary evidence for this camp is very ambiguous, and it's hard to find much evidence. And if there weren't photographs and some sort of kind of recording of it, they would be lost without trace. So that's kind of some sort of comment about the value of what archaeology can do. Okay, that's a little bit about sort of biblical archaeology, which I think more nowadays is more often referred to as kind of Near Eastern archaeology, to kind of get it out of that close connection with the Bible. So just to go a little bit back to saying what how archaeology is organized, because if you're not an archaeologist, I think the whole process of how archaeology works is often a bit confusing. Basically, there's two types of archaeological intervention. I mean, there are more, but and when we're talking about excavations in any case, and these are things like research archaeology. So this is the idea that you have an idea of something you want to test, so going back to that model, you want to see if certain people lived in a certain place at a certain time, or you want to see why people stopped living there or how they lived. You want to find out about why a certain area doesn't have any inhabitants today, something like that. So you can devise a research agenda around that, and then you can test it by either doing excavations, surveys, lots of things like that. So that's what a lot of people are most people are aware of. But one thing that's grown up really, I suppose, since the 1970s or maybe in the 1940s is the idea of contract or rescue archaeology or developer archaeology. And that's where you get new buildings that are built. And this is a thing that archaeologists lobbied for worldwide, as they said, well, when you're doing this, we need to see what's underneath these buildings. We need to kind of record it. And it's become enshrined in many places that the developers of any particular area will have to pay for excavations. And this is actually what most archaeology is nowadays. Most excavations are actually funded in this way. And because it's funded by developers who are making huge amounts of money, there's obviously more money available. So this is an example of a developer or contract or rescue archaeology at Ramla. You can just see in the background the White Tower of Ramla, the Tower of the White Mosque in Ramla, and here you can see some new housing being built. And now actually this entire region this entire city is kind of developed. I mean, Ramla is a particularly interesting city because partly because the inhabitants were strongly encouraged to leave at the time of the creation of Israel, and also because the Israeli state very kind of strongly neglected any provision of services to Ramla, which meant that the people, it was kind of a place with very little economy, very underdeveloped, and also sort of a thriving drug trade as well and criminal trade. So, and this was kind of encouraged. And why was this the case in Ramla? Well, Ramla is the only city in Palestine which was founded specifically by the Arabs, by the Muslim Arabs. So it does have no pre-Islamic past. So it had no kind of thing that the Israelis could tap into in that sense. I mean, they have kind of tried. But since the 1990s, when lots of new Russian immigrants came in, they decided to settle a lot of them in Ramla. And so they built all these houses and they did huge scale excavations, which apparently are still continuing all over the site. The results of the excavations are very interesting. The method of excavation is, I suppose, firstly, I should say the method of excavation is possibly slightly old-fashioned. The other thing is, I think, the people who are actually doing the excavations, and this is interesting, I talked about research archaeology before. The people who do research archaeology are generally people who are trained in a specific field, and they're either students or research students, and often cases they'll pay quite a lot of money to do this. In the case of Ramla, most of the archaeology was carried out by newly arrived Russian immigrants, and the idea is basically a way of kind of paying for people. And so a lot of things were missed from the archaeology. So a lot of the buildings in Ramla were kind of not identified simply because of the use of mud brick. These people had no experience of doing archaeology at all, so it's not that surprising that they kind of missed this. But certainly by now, this is just a mosaic pavement with a press in the that was discovered. But I suppose the good thing about rescue or contract archaeology within Israel is it's not ideologically driven. So there is no agenda for this type of archaeology. The idea really is this is something you've got to do. So people do it, and sometimes it's published. And when it is published, it's often not interpreted. And a lot of it just forms something which in archaeology we call grey literature. So it's kind of accessible, but not that accessible for people to kind of read, and it's not really sort of pieced together. So that's Ramla. Okay, now so The next thing I'm going to talk about a little bit is about the idea of archaeology as conflict. As I said at the beginning of this, there's an idea that archaeology, well, particularly excavation, really destroys evidence. It removes soil, and the soil or the rocks or whatever you're removing its relationship to other things. And once you do that, you don't know how, you have no, unless you record it, you have no idea how that happened. And it's possible, and this is what's quite interesting in this context, it's possible to remove large layers, large amounts of material. And then once it's removed from the context, even if you have the stone blocks, the earth, the sand, or whatever you've removed, even if you have all that, you don't know what it means. It's just meaningless if it's stacked up somewhere. The only thing that can tell you what it means is the record of the excavation showing how things relate to each other. And so, and in a sense, if you do archaeology without recording, it's kind of as damaging as a conflict can be. Now, the other thing I'll just mention, I'll just put up this picture. The other thing I'll just mention about archaeology and conflict is archaeology around the world is often very much involved in conflict and becoming more closely related to it. And this goes back a long way. For example, in Bulgaria, in the early 20th century, approximately 90% of the Ottoman monuments were destroyed as a conscious policy of changing both the appearance and the evidence of the. I was going to say the Ottoman occupation, but really Bulgaria was an intrinsic part of the Ottoman Empire, and even one of the central areas. But it was regarded after 1878 as something that was kind of not desirable. Also, you've got, for example, the famous example of the Babur Masjid at Ayodhya, which was destroyed by Hindu nationalists. Again, to do with a sort of kind of ethnic, religious conflict. And then, of course, you've got racist archaeology. The Nazis did archaeology in Hedeby in northern Germany, and there's also the archaeology of Great Zimbabwe, which for a long time the colonial administrators insisted was something that was not built by local people in Zimbabwe, but had to have been built by, well, at the minimum Arabs, but preferably by the Queen of Sheba. So that's kind of another way we have sort of cultural conflict over archaeology. And then we get to sort of people who are actively, I suppose, carrying out something to do with archaeology during conflict. And so this person is sort of quite recognizable. This is the Israeli general, Moshe Dayan. He was born in 1915 and he died in the 1980s. And so he was very, very famous general, and he's kind of revered by the Israelis because of his military success. And in 1967, he was Minister of Defense. And as I say, really kind of revered in Israel and regarded as kind of a national hero. So the idea is you can't really say anything wrong about him today. And actually that is apparently still kind of true. However, recently there've been lots of rumours about Moshe Dayan's activities, and these are activities involved in the various conflicts in Sinai and the West Bank and all over the place. And these rumours were about that he had an interest in antiquities. And apparently his interest was first aroused at Tel el-Hesi, where he came across or found an Iron Age jar, which he decided was quite nice, and he decided to keep it. And then so far there's been somebody documenting this. He's been implicated in the looting of more than 35 sites. These are the ones that are known about. So And it's interesting, this distribution of sites follows his military activities. So you can, from looking at the sites that he, excavated, looted, you can actually see where he was and where sort of militarily. So one of the famous ones is Serebit al-Khadim in the Sinai, where he took, this is not it, but he took a large pillar inscribed with hieroglyphics. And he was actually, this is one of the few cases where he's actually brought to task about this. So he's asked in the parliament, in the Knesset, there are rumours about this. And his answer was, he said, well, the Egyptians aren't doing anything with it, and instead of it being destroyed, let it be in a museum. Now, surprisingly or not surprisingly, depending on your view, it somehow didn't get to a museum. Well, not in his lifetime in any case. Eventually, after he died, I think it actually found its way to a museum. But this is only one of many, many sites, many antiquities, which were kind of looted from the archaeology of the region by this general, who, incidentally, I'd say he was fully aware of that what he was doing was not correct, not really archaeology, fully aware of it, but still he regarded it as his prerogative from his position. This is just a picture of the Zion gate, so it sort of bears traces of conflict of the old city of Jerusalem. And I'm just going to say a little bit now. I haven't really got pictures to illustrate this, but I'm just going to say a little bit about something which is, and I'm not going to say too much about it because I could actually go on for a long, long time about it. But I think it is actually very important. And this can all be documented, and to a certain extent has been documented, but it's very important. And this is the complicity of the Israeli Department of Antiquities, as it was called until the 90s, in archaeology as a means of both acquiring land and also expelling populations. And so one of the examples, for example, is in 1968, the inhabitants of Tel Gezer, which is quite near Ramla, and this is how I came across it in the literature, because I was interested. Apparently the water supply in Ramla was from Tel Gezer, and I was trying to look at evidence for this in documentation. Well, one of the things is that there was actually a village there, and looking at the records, and this has been pieced together by some Israeli historians and others, and so the inhabitants were moved out of the site because of the archaeology. The idea is the archaeology was kind of the excuse for removing them, and all the buildings, the village buildings, apart from one or two, were destroyed. It's interesting, and perhaps I'm missing something, but I've looked through the publications, and there have been some recent publications. But it's interesting, you get publications of little bits of the site, but it's very, very hard to form an overall impression of how these relate to the unity of the Tel. And I think that's probably related to the fact that they're of the village, and there's a sort of kind of a reluctance to show that there was actually this village there. Another famous example is Tel Istud, or Ashdod, which is in the south between Gaza and Jaffa. And here there's a number of important medieval buildings which were destroyed as part of the idea to reclaim the site for the archaeology. Fortunately, one archaeologist did actually object and managed to record one of the buildings, but the other one was kind of completely destroyed. And then the third example, there are many of these, is the village of Zarain, or which is identified with the biblical site of Tel Jezreel, and this is in the in the north of the country. And again, there's a village that was kind of cleared, and the inhabitants removed, and later an excavation was carried out which actually bulldozed the remains of the later period. Now, later periods goes back to, I think later in that case counted as anything sort of post-Roman. A small part of the site was reserved for looking at the later periods, basically not much was really done about that. And the slightly horrible thing about it is that, and this could probably be repeated in many places, also the village cemetery was excavated and it wasn't very old. I mean, that's all I need to say at this point, but not very good. So, okay, so carrying on the idea of archaeology. So this is obviously the old city of Jerusalem. Okay, now archaeology can be used for kind of creating space. So one of the ideas is all land within the old city of Jerusalem, you can't rebuild on it, you can't repair, and so it means that a lot of sort of derelict sites, derelict from warfare or to not being able to be repaired, can kind of be claimed. And in this case, claimed on an archaeological base because they're too important, and so in this case they're used as a settlement within the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem. Yeah, and of course the Israeli occupation of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, meant lots of things, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the destruction of the Moroccan quarter in Jerusalem. And the idea of this was to provide access for Israelis to get to the Western Wall, to enable them to go to the wall of the temple, and huge excavations were carried out there with the expectation, I think, of finding substantial remains of a Jewish presence. I mean, unfortunately for them, actually, the main thing that they found was a huge Umayyad palatial complex, plus some various other things. But nevertheless, the area has been cleared. And again, it's that thing of, I know that large amounts of evidence is still sort of unpublished. So the Umayyad palace has been published, but there's also things like, we know there's a very interesting, for example, tavern or coffee house, which would be pretty unique from the 16th century, which is completely removed. And then just outside this area, we've got, I don't know if you can see it, the City of David is in there. It's famous excavations. And this is again the idea of using archaeology to expropriate land and kind of within East Jerusalem, in theory, by well, you all know this, according to international law, you can't really do this, but it's sort of a special case. And so this is just a view of the ongoing excavations in the City of David. So that's one aspect of conflict archaeology. There's another aspect I'd like to mention, though, and this kind of is to say really that sort of, I suppose, within Israeli society, they're not entirely unified about this, and there are also internal conflicts, and also there's probably multiple views about how archaeology should be carried out. So, for example, in the 1980s, there was, I think, the chief rabbi, I'm not quite sure of his exact title, it's probably more specific than that, but the chief rabbi of Israel issued a curse against all archaeologists. I'm not sure if that was all archaeologists in this country or all over the world. And it was because of this idea of handling human remains, because the idea was that archaeologists disturb human remains, and human remains, which I think we're mostly thinking about things like skeletons, should be left intact so you can have full resurrection of the body. And this kind of occurs in a lot of different religions, but for the Orthodox rather than the ultra-Orthodox Jews, this is considered as very important and something that's kind of worth fighting about. And so this became a huge sort of confrontation. And still there is a big conflict between, I suppose, the sort of so-called secular, but they're Orthodox Israeli community, and also the ultra-Orthodox who kind of reject the idea of carrying out this archaeology. And this is just kind of the types of things that they're particularly against. One of the things I think that's quite interesting from an archaeological perspective, though, is that in many ways, this is from the Rockefeller Museum, by the way, that in many ways this anticipates things that happened elsewhere in archaeology. So I think, although there've often been unease about handling human remains and how archaeologists deal with human remains is really, I think, the ultra-Orthodox objection to this treatment of remains by the Israel Antiquities Authority that really actually sparked interest elsewhere. So in that sense, it's actually been kind of quite a positive, I'd say it's made people think a lot more about, I suppose, archaeologists think a lot more about the value of human remains and how you should treat them, and kind of the idea of respect. This is just some of the tombs on the Mount of Olives, Jewish tombs, and overlooking. So the idea is that the actual complete body skeleton is here, ready to get up on the day of resurrection. So the idea is you actually have to be located just there in the right place. It's not just anywhere, but you have to be there and you have to kind of be intact. Right. Yeah. So the next thing, I think, I'll just check. The next thing is just, not quite the last thing, but the next thing is that kind of archaeology is time travel. Now, a colleague of mine a while ago, he wrote an article about Doctor Who and archaeology. I'm not sure, actually, probably most of you probably don't know who Doctor Who is, but it's a series on television in Britain, and it's about this doctor who keeps on changing his appearance every couple of years because you get a new actor, but it's the same person, and he and now a she, because they've got they change his form and can go basically traveling through time. So the place is usually something like Britain, but the actual time varies, so you can go back in time and forward in time. And so the idea is that archaeology is actually one of the ways that you can actually do that. You can move in that fourth dimension. And that's both, I suppose, things like evidence, you can actually reconstruct things, but it's also kind of the tactile nature of it, that you can actually touch things, you can actually experience something from the past that nobody's maybe touched for 1,000, 2,000 years. And that's one of the kind of things about archaeology. And so, and then I'll just mention briefly, because I don't want to talk too much about Orientalism, but there's the idea, which I'm sure is often discussed here, is the idea of Orientalism, this idea of the West, however you define that, looking at the East as something that's kind of unchanging. And there's definitely this in a lot of biblical archaeology, the idea that, well, Palestine is great because people still live like they do in the Bible. The country still looks the same as it did in the Bible. The fact that it doesn't matter. That's what people thought. They thought that what they saw was kind of the same way as it was in the Bible. That was what struck them, because, of course, people were so imbued with the Bible, they're so aware of it, that that's what they were kind of looking out to see. Now, this is one of the tunnels underneath the Haram, which is kind of the kind of temple area. There's a big sign here, seeing if I can read it. An interesting conflation of religiousness and archaeology here, saying that you have to respect it as a holy site. Now, I suppose the thing to say about this in terms of future archaeology or archaeology of time travel is this is kind of like a tunnel going back in time, trying to rediscover the ancient temple, the time of kind of Jewish greatness, great Israel. And the idea is you can walk through this, but also there's also within this, I will say I haven't actually seen it, but I know that it's there. There's a place, a museum that you can go to, strange museum, maybe we could team up with this here, is they've got a museum which contains all the fittings for when the temple is rebuilt. So they have hinges, they have doorknobs, they have all the what surrounds everything ready for when the temple site becomes clear again and they can actually build the future Jerusalem. So that's kind of, so there's actually this museum of things that will be in the temple once they've dealt with a few local difficulties. So that's one idea of the future. And then another idea of future archaeology is this idea of reenactment. So the idea that you can actually kind of live and act out a past within an archaeological setting. I suppose the thing about this is inside the Jaffa Gate of Jerusalem, and this is somebody. There's lots of people like this there who play the harp and sort of kind of relic. Sort of looking back to the days of like the Old Testament, I suppose. But the idea is that actually the actual archaeology, the actual science of this doesn't really matter. That actually what's more important is the reality of kind of acting this out, and this kind of direct link to the past. So I'm just going to try something now. I'm not sure if it will work, but if it doesn't, it doesn't matter. Okay. So this is just one of the reenactments of David's harp, I suppose. But this is the idea of and the other. This is the Jordan River, by the way, taken a long time ago. But the idea of this is this I suppose this fantasy of this land, with no people in it, with the nature, and sort of really going back to a time which was kind of biblical, which was inhabited by people. You actually read about these few tribes who are living a very sort of very righteous and sort of kind of nice life. So okay, so that's enough of that. But the last thing I'll just say, just quickly, is just a few things about authenticity, which, as I said, I think is like kind of an important thing in archaeology, and some of this kind of I suppose favours the type of archaeology that sort of takes place in Israel. The first is the general idea that the older something is, the better it is, and this is it's quite hard to get away from this, because I suppose as humans have developed, we've been producing more and more junk into the future. So in the past, we didn't quite produce so much junk. So there's much more of more recent times that's kind of available. So it's kind of more common in that sense. But I think there's a danger in thinking things that the older the better, because obviously older things are important. But it doesn't mean, in my view anyway, that you should disregard the evidence from more recent time. The other thing related to that's more or less the same thing is that the idea of something that you can name, like a site or an object, something you can name, identify, is somehow better than something that's unnamed. So if you find, for example, the tomb of King David, that's better than finding sort of workers' tombs or something like that. And that's a general feeling, although there's a strong thing in archaeology that it shouldn't be that way. It's just that is kind of one of the things. And again, related to that is the idea of something being unique or rare. Again, that's a bit difficult because of the relationship to, I suppose, art markets. But I think the two last points are probably more important, is to do with that authenticity. Is the idea of what's tangible, what you can actually touch. And I think, because although archaeology is really about information and about reconstructing the past or reconstructing how human society has developed, the tangible, what you can actually touch, is still important. And it's not just sort of like for the experience of it. It's also, if you think going back to the first idea, the idea of courtrooms, of forensic stuff. Still in courtrooms, they like to show the actual evidence. You actually have to have it to see it, and jurors might like to actually see that. So there's the importance of what you can actually touch is important. And then the last thing, which I think is quite interesting in relation to how the Israelis do archaeology, and it's something worth thinking about, and how it fits, I'm not quite sure. But this idea of indigenous people versus against migrant people, and that can be used both ways, and it really is a question of definition to what is indigenous and what is a migrant. But that's kind of something that certainly is played into that, and you certainly find it used within the wider context of, I suppose, certain types of Israeli archaeology. Okay, so I think that's it. Okay, thank you.